Every 15th of the month, exactly at 2 p.m., he would come. Never said a word to the barber, just sat in the chair, got his hair cut, and left. For 30 years. No hello, no thank you. Joe the barber wasn't bothered, but he was curious. Until he died, and they found that letter in his cash box. The brass bell above Thompson's barbershop door had been chiming the same tune for 43 years. In Millbrook, Ohio, some things never changed. The red and white striped pole still spun lazily outside. The checkerboard floor still squeaked under the third tile from the door. And Joe Thompson still opened at 8 a.m. sharp every Tuesday through Saturday. The shop was a relic of simpler times. Chrome-armed chairs with cracked leather seats, mirrors spotted with age, and shelves lined with bottles of hair tonic that probably hadn't changed their formula since the 1960s. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, high school football teams, wedding parties, soldiers in uniform, and generations of Millbrook families who'd trusted Joe with their hair and their stories. But if you asked Joe what never changed the most, he'd point to the second chair from the window. Every 15th of the month at exactly 2 p.m., a man would walk through that door. Same man, same time, same silence. The other customers had noticed the pattern over the years. Mrs. Henderson, who came every Thursday for her weekly set, once joked that you could set your calendar by Joe's Mystery Man. Old Pete Kowalski, a retired steel worker who'd been coming to Joe for 25 years, tried to strike up conversations with the silent customer, but gave up after a few attempts. Robert Mitchell was his name, though Joe didn't learn that until year 15, when he accidentally glimpsed the name on a prescription bottle that fell from the man's pocket. Bob, as he came to think of him, was somewhere in his 40s when he first a tall but not imposing, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. He was weathered but not broken, like an old leather jacket that had seen storms but still held together. He wore the same type of clothes every visit, clean jeans that were pressed but not new, a button-down shirt always tucked in, and work boots that had seen better decades but were polished to a respectable shine. There was something about his posture, straight-backed, alert, constantly aware of his surroundings, that reminded Joe of the soldiers he'd known. The ritual never varied. Bob would enter without greeting, pause for just a moment to scan the shop, then hang his jacket on the third hook from the left. Never the first, never the second, always the third. He'd sit in that second chair, which Joe noticed gave him a clear view of both the door and the street outside. No magazine, no small talk, no acknowledgement of other customers. He would simply point to his head with a single finger, and Joe would know exactly what to do. A trim, neat around the ears, slightly longer on top. Military precise. Joe had been cutting hair long enough to recognize the signs. The way Bob held his shoulders, the slight flinch when a car backfired outside, how his eyes would track to the mirror whenever someone entered behind him. The careful way he counted out exact change, never letting his guard down completely. During the haircut, Bob would sit perfectly still, his hands resting on the chair's arms in a position that seemed practiced, ready. Joe learned to move slowly around him, to announce when he was reaching for a different tool, to avoid sudden movements that might startle his silent customer. For 30 years, Joe had tried everything in those early years. He'd commented on the weather, asked about the Buckeyes' chances this season, even mentioned local news about the proposed new highway. Bob would respond with a nod, sometimes a grunt, occasionally what might have been the beginning of a smile, but never words. After the first decade, Joe stopped trying to fill the silence with chatter. After the second, he found it almost peaceful. After the third, it became something deeper than routine. It became trust. Other customers noticed, of course, and they had theories. Millbrook was a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, except for Bob Mitchell's. They'd whisper their speculations while waiting their turn. Maybe he was mute, maybe he was rude, maybe he was just another strange loner. Some suggested he might be one of those shell-shocked veterans you heard about, but that was usually dismissed. The Iraq War had ended years ago, and Bob looked too young for Vietnam, but Joe defended him quietly, consistently. He pays, he's polite in his way, and he never causes trouble, Joe would say when someone made a comment. Some folks just aren't talkers. World's got enough noise as it is. What Joe didn't tell them was how Bob always left a $20 bill for a $12 haircut every single time. Never asked for change, never waited for thanks. He'd place the bill on the counter next to the register, put on his jacket with the same methodical precision he did everything else, and leave. And there was something else Joe noticed but never mentioned to anyone, not even his wife Mary. Sometimes, just sometimes, when Joe was trimming around Bob's ears, he'd catch glimpses of scarring along his neck and the back of his head. Thin white lines that spoke of old wounds, the kind that didn't come from accidents or fights, but from something much more serious. Joe had been cutting hair since 1962. He'd seen men come back from Vietnam, watched them struggle to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. His own younger brother Danny had been one of them. Came home speaking in half sentences and jumping at loud noises. Danny had worked through it eventually, found his voice again, but it had taken years. Looking at Bob, Joe recognized the signs: the hypervigilance, the need for control, the careful distance maintained from everyone and everything. This was a man carrying something heavy, something that words couldn't touch. The truth was, Joe had grown fond of the silent stranger. There was something comforting about the predictability, something honorable about a man who kept his word without saying one. In a world that never stopped talking, scrolling, updating, and commenting, Bob Mitchell's silence felt like a sanctuary. Over the decades, Joe began to notice small details others missed. How Bob's hands, which remained perfectly steady during the haircut, trembled slightly when he reached for his wallet. How he always arrived exactly on time, but would sometimes sit in his truck outside for several minutes before coming in, as if gathering courage for this simple interaction. How on certain dates, always in February, always around the 15th, Bob's eyes would be red-rimmed when he arrived, like he'd been crying. Joe never asked about these things. He'd learned, through years of watching his brother Danny struggle, that sometimes the greatest kindness you could offer someone was the absence of questions. There were other small rituals, too. Bob would always check the locks on his truck twice before entering the shop. He'd position himself in the chair so he could see the reflection of the door in the mirror. And he'd always, without fail, touch his chest briefly before leaving, just a quick pat over his heart, like he was checking that something was still there. By year 20, Joe realized that these monthly visits had become as important to him as they were to Bob. The barber shop could be chaotic sometimes. Kids squirming in chairs, businessmen rushing through lunch-hour trims, retirees holding court with stories that went nowhere. But when Bob sat in that second chair, the whole space seemed to settle. Even the other customers would lower their voices, sensing something sacred was taking place. Joe's wife, Mary, often asked about his mystery customer. She'd been keeping the books for the barber shop for 15 years and had noticed the pattern of $20 payments for $12 services. "Why don't you just ask him what his story is?" she'd suggest. "Maybe he wants to talk, but doesn't know how to start." But Joe understood something Mary didn't quite grasp. Bob's silence wasn't a wall, it was a sanctuary. And Joe's acceptance of that silence was his own small act of service, as important in its way as anything he'd ever done with scissors and comb, until February 15th, 2022. Joe woke that morning feeling different. Not sick, exactly, but heavy in a way that reminded him of his age. At 78, he'd been cutting hair for 40 years, raised 3 kids who were now scattered across different states with families of their own, and loved his wife Mary through thick and thin. His hands still steady, his eyes still sharp, but lately he'd been feeling the weight of all those years. The chest pains started around 11, dull at first, then sharp, then radiating down his left arm in a way that made Mary's face go white when he described it. By noon, he was in Millbrook General Hospital, tubes running into his arms and wires attached to his chest, watching the monitors beep out the irregular rhythm of a heart that was finally admitting its age. Dr. Martinez, a young cardiologist who looked like she should still be in college, spoke in gentle but serious tones about arterial blockages and surgical options. "We need to get you stabilized first," she explained. "Then we'll talk about next steps." But Joe wasn't thinking about next steps. At 1:50 p.m., as he watched the clock on the hospital wall tick toward 2, all he could think about was Bob. For the first time in 30 years, that second chair would be empty at 2 p.m. on the 15th. The thought bothered Joe more than the pain in his chest, more than the uncertainty of his diagnosis, more than the fear of what tomorrow might bring. He imagined Bob walking into the empty shop, finding it dark and locked. Would he understand what happened? Would he wait outside, confused? Would he simply drive away and never come back? Mary was there, holding his hand with both of hers, trying not to cry. She'd called the kids, she said. Michael was driving down from Cleveland, Sarah was catching a flight from Denver, and little Tommy was taking a bus from Columbus. The whole family would be here soon. "Joe," Mary whispered, squeezing his fingers, "is there anything you need to tell me? Any unfinished business? Any regrets?" Joe thought for a long moment, his mind drifting from the hospital room to the familiar comfort of his barbershop. He thought about all the conversations he'd had over the years, all the stories customers had shared, all the community he'd helped build one haircut at a time. But most of all, he thought about the conversations he'd never had, the stories he'd never heard, and one customer who had trusted him enough to sit in silence. "In the cash box," Joe whispered, his voice hoarse from the oxygen mask they'd had him wear earlier, "there's an envelope, behind the 20s, taped to the bottom. It's for Bob, the quiet customer who comes every 15th. Mary frowned, leaning closer. "What envelope, honey? What quiet customer?" But the morphine was kicking in now, pulling Joe towards sleep. "Every 15th, he murmured, his words slurring slightly. "Every 15th at 2, promised him I'd understand." His eyes closed, and Mary felt his grip loosen. Joe Thompson died 3 hours later, never explaining what he meant. His heart simply stopped, as peacefully as if he'd decided he was finished with this particular haircut and it was time to move on to the next customer. Mary found the envelope exactly where Joe had said it would be, taped to the bottom of the old metal cash box that had served the barbershop since the day they opened. It was sealed, yellowed slightly with age, and written in Joe's careful handwriting was a single name: Bob, for when I'm not here to understand anymore. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it contained more than just paper. Mary turned it over in her hands, wondering how long it had been hidden there, wondering what her husband had known that he'd never shared with her. The funeral was held 3 days later at Millbrook Methodist Church, the same church where Joe and Mary had been married 41 years earlier. The service was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the fellowship hall. Half of Millbrook came to pay their respects to the man who'd been cutting their hair for 4 decades, who'd listened to their stories, celebrated their joys, and offered quiet comfort during their sorrows. Stories were shared from the pulpit and during the informal reception afterward. People talked about Joe's gentle hands, his terrible jokes, his ability to remember every customer's preferred length and style, even after years between visits. They spoke of his honesty, his kindness, his way of making everyone feel welcome in his chair, regardless of their station in life. But in the back row, sitting alone and unnoticed by most of the mourners, was a figure that Mary had never seen before. He was tall, gray-haired, wearing a dark suit that looked like it had been taken out of mothballs for the occasion. His hands were folded in his lap, his shoulders straight, and his eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket at the front of the church. When the service ended and people began filing out, shaking hands with the family and offering condolences, this man remained seated. Mary watched him from her position near the front, something tugging at her memory. There was something familiar about his stillness, his careful distance from the crowd. As the church emptied, the man finally stood. He moved slowly, deliberately, toward where Mary was gathering flowers and memorial cards. When he reached her, he stopped and waited, as if asking permission to speak. "You're Bob," Mary said suddenly, the recognition hitting her like a revelation. "The 15th of every month, 2 o'clock. He nodded once, a gesture so economical and precise that it told her everything she needed to know about his character. After the service, Mary approached him. She'd never met him, but something about his posture, his silence, told her who he was. "You're Bob," she said softly. "The 15th of every month." He nodded once. "Joe left something for you," she continued, pulling an envelope from her purse. "He made me promise to give it to you." Bob took the envelope with shaking hands. His name was written on the front in Joe's careful script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated just weeks before Joe's death. "Dear Bob, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. For 30 years, you've been my most faithful customer. Never missed a month. Never caused trouble. Never said much, but somehow said everything. I want you to know that I understood. Maybe not at first, but over time, I figured it out. The way you held yourself. The way you looked at your reflection but never quite met your own eyes. The way you flinched when sirens went by. The way you always sat facing the door. I recognized it because my brother came back from Vietnam the same way. Different war, same wounds. He never talked about it either. Some things are too heavy for words. I don't know what you saw over there, Bob. I don't know what you lost or what you carry, but I want you to know that your silence never bothered me. In fact, it honored me. You trusted me enough to sit in that chair for 30 years without having to explain yourself. That meant more to me than any conversation ever could have. I hope you find your voice again someday. But if you don't, that's okay too. Some of the best people I've known spoke loudest in their silence. Thank you for letting an old barber be part of your healing, even if it was just for 20 minutes every month. Your friend, whether you know it or not, Joe Thompson. P.S. I've left instructions with Mary. The shop is closing, but that chair will always be yours if you ever want to sit in it again. Bob read the letter 3 times before the tears came. 30 years of silence, and Joe had understood all along. He'd never pushed, never pried, never made Bob feel broken. He'd just given him a safe place to exist without explanation. For the first time in 3 decades, Robert Mitchell spoke aloud in public. His voice was rusty, barely above a whisper, but clear enough for Mary to hear. He was a good man, Bob said, folding the letter carefully. A very good man. Mary smiled through her tears. He said you were too. Bob looked toward the empty barber shop, its windows already dark. I should have told him about Jimmy, he said, more to himself than to Mary. Jimmy? She asked gently. Bob's hand went to his chest, where underneath his shirt hung 2 sets of dog tags. One had his name, the other belonged to Private James Jimmy Patterson, Bob's best friend who died in his arms in Fallujah, Iraq, on the 15th of February, 2003. I got his haircut every month, Bob explained quietly. Same way he liked it. Jimmy always said he wanted to look sharp for the angels. His voice cracked. I couldn't find the words to explain that to Joe. I was afraid he'd think I was crazy. Mary reached out and touched Bob's arm. Honey, she said softly, Joe would have understood that too. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. Bob Mitchell walked into the Millbrook Community Center on a Thursday evening when the monthly Veterans Support Group was meeting in the back room. He'd driven past the building dozens of times over the years, had seen the small sign advertising the meetings, but had never found the courage to stop. Tonight was different. Tonight, he carried Joe's letter in his shirt pocket, and for the first time in decades, the weight of silence felt heavier than the weight of speaking. The group was small, maybe 8 or 10 people, sitting in a circle of folding chairs. Some were older, Vietnam-era veterans with gray beards and weathered faces. Others were younger, men and women who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, who carried their own invisible wounds. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, welcomed Bob warmly and gestured to an empty chair. Bob sat in the back, said nothing during the first meeting, but stayed for the full hour. The next month, he came again. The third month, when Dr. Chen asked if anyone wanted to share something new, Bob raised his hand. My name is Robert Mitchell, he said, his voice rusty from disuse but stronger than he'd expected. And I'd like to tell you about my friend Jimmy, and about a barber who taught me that silence can be its own kind of healing. The room went quiet as Bob began to speak. He told them about Private James Jimmy Patterson, his battle buddy, his closest friend, the kid from Detroit who could make anyone laugh even in the darkest moments. He told them about February 15th, 2003, in Fallujah, when an IED turned their Humvee into a death trap and Jimmy died in Bob's arms. whispering about how he'd wanted to look sharp for the angels. He told them about the guilt that followed him home, the nightmares that made sleep impossible, the way crowds made him panic and loud noises sent him diving for cover. He explained how he'd started getting Jimmy's haircut every month, the same style his friend had always requested, a way of honoring the dead while punishing the living. For 30 years, Bob said, his voice thick with emotion, I sat in that chair getting a haircut for a ghost, and Joe never asked why. He never pushed. He never made me feel broken or crazy. He just gave me a place to exist without having to explain myself. Bob pulled the letter from his pocket, its edges soft from handling. When he died, he left me this. Turns out he knew all along. He'd been through it with his own brother. He understood things I couldn't put into words. The room was completely silent now. Some of the other veterans were crying, others nodding in recognition. Dr. Chen had tears in her eyes as she watched this man, who had been carrying his burden alone for 3 decades, finally find his voice. Today, if you visit Millbrook, you'll find a small memorial plaque outside the old Thompson barber shop. It reads, "In memory of Joe Thompson, who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness is knowing when not to ask questions, and Bob Mitchell, who found his voice again through the gift of patient silence." Below that, in smaller text, every 15th of the month, 2 p.m., a chair reserved for healing. Some stories don't need words to be told. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen in complete silence, and sometimes it takes 30 years to realize that someone was listening all along. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't walking alone. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to True Heroic Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.